was founded on a philosophy that put the community at the heart of its existence. Today, we are a $100 billion global enterprise.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning, Nisha. Morning, Nisha. Morning, Mr. Very good to see you.
I should say good evening as
Our
well.
today has been built on enduring values.
Morning. Good evening. Sorry, to you, good evening.
Ambassador Singh, do you have a Twitter account?
No.
You're a smart man.
Our today is about delivering excellence across business sectors. Our today is about building a future-ready nation. Our today has a strong foundation with community at its core. Our today is dedicated to the communities we serve. Our today is always about more than just today. Our today is a continuous journey for a better tomorrow. Tata, leadership with trust.
सर, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता। साहब, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता। हुजूर, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता।
Hello, everybody. This is the primary US-focused panel of the CII's Partnership Summit. We have a great panel today, stretching literally all the way from California to Delhi. And the US-India relationship, it's obvious, I think, to anybody in the audience, is the most important bilateral relationship that India has today and has been for quite a while. We've all seen it grow constantly now for the past 20, 30 years, stretching back to the Clinton administration, continuing under the Bush administration, Obama, Trump, and now we're looking forward to a new administration, the Biden one. President-elect Biden is no stranger to India. He's no stranger to the US-India relationship. Many of you will know he was a great supporter of the US-India nuclear deal when it was first put forward. But we have a large number of issues as a consequence of having such a good relationship. And a number of questions regarding where the relationship is going, particularly on things like China, on trade, on investment. And we have a panel, which I'll introduce as we go along, to speak about almost every element of the relationship as we go forward. The Confederation of Indian Industries has been one of the strongest supporters of the bilateral relationship between the United States and India. Which is one of the reasons this panel, I think, is both so important and should we say, has such an enlightened group of people to speak today. I will begin by turning to Bruce Stokes, who has a presentation to explain the US election, which is something that I think a lot of people in India have been suitably both bemused and baffled by, and it continues to be of great interest. As a journalist, I can say we in the media have been spending a lot of time on this election. Bruce is the executive director of the German Marshall Fund's Transatlantic Task Force, and previously was a director at the Pew Research Center in Washington, D.C. Many of you may know him from the annual Global Opinion surveys and the annual Indian survey that he, in fact, I believe you introduced into the Pew Research Center's portfolio. So Bruce, I'll go ahead. Please Bruce has a presentation, a set of slides, and we'll talk around those.
Pramit, thank you, and it's a pleasure and a privilege and an honor to be here with such an esteemed panel. And what I'd like to do is share with folks what we think we may know about the implications of the election for U.S.-India relations. Part of that has to do with American public opinion about issues that affect India, and part of it has to do with what it says about the American political system and what Indians can expect from the U.S. system. So I'm going to share with folks now on the screen a small PowerPoint. We all know the outcome of the election. Joe Biden has won, even though President Trump has not acknowledged that yet, by more than 7 million votes, about 4.4% of the popular vote lead, and won in the Electoral College. So this race is over, and Joe Biden has won. I think one thing that Americans and foreigners don't fully appreciate is that no matter how you felt about the election of Joe Biden and the defeat of Donald Trump, one thing that is increasingly clear about the American political system is that this change in power is part of a growing instability in the American political system. If you look at what has happened in American politics between 1960 and 1978, there were 3 changes of power in the House, the Senate, and/or the White House. In the next 20 years, there were 4 changes. In the next 20 years, there were 8 changes in the House, the Senate, or the White House, and now we've had a 9th change. So one thing, again, no matter how you feel about the outcome, this system is increasingly unstable. And that has implications for policy follow-through, et cetera. We also are reminded that America remains deeply divided along partisan lines. One can argue, certainly, that the winner of this election was American democracy. We had more people, a higher percentage of the public vote in this election than at any time since 1900. That's good. There's no doubt about that. Nevertheless, 8 in 10 Democrats have a negative image of Republicans, and 8 in 10 Republicans have a negative image of Democrats. Our people are not closely aligned with each other. And just to give you almost, well, it's a humorous example if it wasn't so serious. 8 in 10 Democrats think all Republicans are racists, and 8 in 10 Republicans think all Democrats are socialists, which is patently certainly not the case, but that's the depth of the partisanship we face. The good news, I think, of this election is that Biden's base is supportive of many of the issues of importance to U.S.-India relations. As you can see in this Pew survey, Democrats are strongly supportive of all sorts of international cooperation, whether it be through the UN or in dealing with the COVID or just working together in a global community. This has certainly been a theme of Biden as he ran for president, that he wanted to reestablish our alliance relationships. He has strong support for this initiative from his base. This is the Chicago Council survey that showed that Democrats, by 3 to 1, want to sign more free trade agreements with other countries. They want to reduce tariffs on other countries by 3 to 1. And by 3 to 1, they're willing to do more to defend the security of our allies. Again, there is strong support for engagement with the world economically and militarily in our alliances. Americans are, and this really does surprise a lot of both Americans and non-Americans, Americans are increasingly supportive of trade in principle. Democrats more than Republicans, 8 in 10 Democrats think that trade creates opportunities for economic growth, but Republicans are very strongly supportive as well. Now, I will warn you that when I was at Pew, we did surveys that ask more specific questions, and then you get more negative answers. You get Americans believe that trade destroys jobs, they believe it lowers wages, and they don't believe it lowers prices. So that's where the rubber hits the road in terms of the debate around trade. But at least in principle, Americans are more supportive of trade than they have ever been, which does create the opportunity for some movement on that issue. This may or may not be of reassuring to Indians who, as you know, face your own challenges from China. But Americans are more disapproving of China than at any time in our history, at least in recent history. Republicans more than Democrats, but still 7 in 10 Democrats are disapproving of China. So I think you can expect from the Biden administration a fairly tough policy on China. But what's interesting is Biden's base does not want to worsen relations with China economically or because of COVID. The one opportunity for potential united American support for being tougher with China is on human rights. So what are the prospects for a Biden administration? Unfortunately, I think he faces a divided government, which may be even worse than it has been in the past. The plus side is that Biden is a legislator more than an executive. He's comfortable cutting deals. He's a party centrist. He's an institutionalist. He believes in the institutions of government. He maintains a fairly optimistic view of the Republican Party, and he acknowledges he's a transitional figure. That's the good news. The bad news is he had almost no coattails. If you look at presidents who have been elected to try to clean up messes from their predecessors, Reagan or FDR, Lincoln, Biden's margin of victory was the least of any of those. The Democrats have only picked up one seat in the Senate so far. They're still 2 seats behind. That may change after the January election in Georgia, but I think most people think it won't change. So the Democrats will not control the Senate. And while pundits believed that the Democrats would pick up between 5 and 15 seats in the House of Representatives if Biden won, they have actually lost at least 9 seats. And the margin of majority for the Democrats in the House of Representatives is, and the congressman can probably correct this, but I think it's about 5 seats. So it's very tenuous control of the House of Representatives on tough votes. Something that is, I think, hard for people to understand or appreciate. Biden will be the first newly elected Democrat without a Democratic-led Senate. It will be the first Democrat in that position since 1884. So we are really in unprecedented territory of how a Democrat-controlled White House deals with a Republican-controlled Senate. And one issue that we should all be paying attention to is that, as many of you know, the United States redistricts its Congress after every census. That will happen between now and 2022. This is done in some states by a independent commission, but in most states it's done by the state legislatures. And Republicans control the governorship in both state legislative branches in 23 states. Democrats control only 15. This means that by more than 2 to 1, the Republicans have control over redistricting. This could set the tone for the makeup of the House of Representatives for the next decade. So on that, I think I'll quit and we will move on to the next panelist. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Yeah, one of the things that as a journalist, foreign editor of a newspaper who studied American history, is that every 4 years I am required to make a presentation to the editorial board of my newspaper to explain the Electoral College, because it's a constant refrain, and at the end of it, everybody on the board looks at me and says, "That's just a crazy system." I said, "Yeah, but it's there. You can't do anything about it. It's not going to be changing." So but I know that 4 years later, I'm going to make the same presentation all over again.
Well, Pramit, we should remember that the United States is governing itself in the 21st century with an 18th century constitution, which was consciously hard to amend. And when I was growing up, we were taught that this was great that you couldn't amend it. But I think now, in retrospect, it's clear that the difficulty in amending it is becoming a major obstacle in governance.
And as you know, and to the rest of the audience, the American Constitution is a federation that was created by effectively 13 independent, semi-independent states coming together. The states, therefore, were very reluctant to cede power to the federal system.
Right.
India was the opposite. We were already a unitary state. So it was very easy to create a centralized election commission as we have, because the state already existed as a giant unitary structure. And in fact, it was the Indian central government that conceded power to the states, automatically moved in a different direction. But speaking of the American congressional system, the next speaker is Representative Ami Bera from California's 7th District. If you eat Blue Diamond almonds, this is the man. This is the man who's responsible for them. And many of you know he's the longest-serving Indian American in the Congress today, and has been a member of the House of Representatives since 2013. So he has survived all of these big shifts in political power that Bruce was describing earlier, and as an Indian American, he's also the chairman of the subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, and non-proliferation. He's a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and I should stress that he's also a medical doctor. So therefore, among many congressmen, he's a particularly strong personal knowledge about both the pandemic and what he sees in terms of America's position in global public health, something that is, of course, exceedingly important. Congressman Bera, let me turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Permit. And I think Bruce gave a great overview of our election and the outcome. We do have a very narrow Democratic majority in the House of Representatives, and regardless of what happens in Georgia, it'll be a very narrow majority one way or the other. And I think it provides some opportunity because actually, if you look at the cabinet that President-elect Biden is putting together, particularly with his foreign affairs national security team, these are well-known individuals and folks that should be able to get through the confirmation process and have working relations with the Republican members. So at least on the foreign affairs side of things, the foreign policy side of things, I think we can do a lot in a bipartisan way. If you watch the events of this week as we're negotiating, additional relief for folks that are victims of the pandemic, businesses, et cetera, you're seeing a bipartisan group of senators, House members coming together to negotiate a deal. And I have to be the consummate optimist because I'm in Congress. I have to get up every day and believe we can make the country and the world a better place. And I think the opportunity which President-elect Biden is uniquely suited towards is cutting deals, getting things done. And it'll require all his legislative skill. Let's turn to U.S.-India, though. And, as Permit, you pointed out in your open, the trajectory of the relationship really has been on the upswing in both Democratic and Republican administrations. And while President Trump's approach to foreign policy was non-traditional, in many ways really kind of taking a bilateral approach, and in many ways, President Trump served as his own lead diplomat at times, didn't really indirectly slow down the relationship between the United States and India. And I think that trajectory will continue and actually probably accelerate under a Biden administration. And I think about it in several different ways. The short term, we're all dealing with this global pandemic, and both as we try to defeat the virus, now that we have effective and workable vaccines, I think there's a real opportunity for the United States and India and the rest of the world to work together, because India clearly has a mature biopharmaceutical vaccine sector. And I think India will play a prominent role as we try to not just vaccinate the Indian domestic population, but India will have an incredible role as we try to vaccinate the rest of the world in both production and the logistics of that. So I think there's a partnership there. As we then look at the economic recovery, I think India will also potentially have a major role. One of the areas that in the midst of the pandemic we spent a lot of time thinking about are the supply chain issues. And what the pandemic's exposed is an over-reliance on a single source supply chain, in this case China. And I think India, particularly again in the pharmaceutical sector, has a real opportunity, and U.S. companies recognize that, European companies recognize that, of building a relationship there. And then thirdly, I think the Biden administration will go back to a multilateral approach to foreign policy and foreign engagement, and I think this is it'll be different than potentially it was even just 4 years ago in the Obama administration. But I think you will see this return of U.S. global leadership in partnership with like-minded allies and countries that share similar values of democracy, of free markets and open markets. But there's my last trip abroad was to India, Sri Lanka, and Nepal in February before travel shut down. And you do see the growing Chinese influence around India, both when we were in Sri Lanka and in Nepal. And you see the tensions on the northern border with China. If you look at Indian domestic polling, attitudes towards China are changing. And as chair of the subcommittee on Asia, as we think about the region as a whole, when we think about our partnership and our relationships, China is always part of that conversation. And I think that is different than the conversations we were having 4 years ago. And I don't know exactly what that looks like, but you've seen the quad relationship between India, Japan, Australia, and the United States continue to thrive and grow. I think that it becomes a stronger relationship. The defense-to-defense relationship that we have with India, has been on a positive trajectory. I think that also continues. And then the economic ties, we're always on the cusp of a trade deal with India. Well, let's get, as we move forward in the Biden administration, let's actually get a trade deal done. And then, I don't know what the Biden administration's approach will be on a large multilateral trade deal like the Trans-Pacific Partnership or some facsimile, but I do think there will be pressure from Congress to try to re-engage in what this looks like. And, as Bruce's slide pointed out, our domestic politics have changed, where it's Democrats that are actually probably going to lead some of this push to re-engage again, whether it's TPP or something similar. You did see the U.S., Canada, Mexico trade deal have broad support. So there are some foundational elements that you could potentially build off of. Look, I also think domestically here in the United States, we do have to understand that our politics are changing, as Bruce pointed out. We do have real domestic issues that we have to address in terms of income inequality, in terms of a population that really does look at the world in two different ways. If you're in California, you see one version of what's happening in the world. If you're in rural Nebraska, you're seeing something different. And we have to figure out how we start to resegregate our politics, because right now it is very segregated. And can Congress, under the Biden administration, actually start to work together? And I think those trends probably continue, but I'm an optimist on the foreign policy side. I think you'll see Democrats and Republicans coming together and being willing to work with the Biden administration. So I know we've got a ton of guests, so I'll toss it back over to you for me.
Thank you. I noticed it's interesting that you use the word segregation to describe America today. That's a historically loaded term in America, but I think it's also interesting because you're right in a way, because now it seems it's segregation on the basis of class, which is something that in American post-war politics has curiously not been a major issue. But meanwhile, I'm now going to turn. We've touched a bit about foreign policy, so that's why it's perfect segue to go towards Ambassador Arun Singh. Arun Singh was an ambassador. He himself, in many ways, represented a quad of relationships, if you wish. He was ambassador to the United States, to Israel, to France, and served in Japan, a country he actually knows very well. So, Ambassador Singh, let me ask you to contribute and talk about where you see the bilateral relationship going under the Biden administration.
Thank you, Pramit. So in fact, if you just look at the composition of the panel we have today, you can capture some of the progress and potential for the India-US relationship. We have Representative Ami Bera, and I remember when he was elected in 2013, he was only the third Indian American ever elected to US Congress. And there was a lot of excitement around that. And since then, we've had 4 or 5 Indian Americans in US Congress at any point of time through several election cycles. So you're seeing an increasing involvement in politics, of course, also at state level and lower level electoral campaigns. And then Nisha was there as in USAID, then as Assistant Secretary of State when I was there. Arun Kumar was there as Assistant Secretary of Commerce. And again, capturing the fact that Indian Americans are beginning to have a presence in the administration, on the Hill, staffers in congressional offices. And of course, Ambassador Wisner has been involved in this relationship for a long, long time. Seeing it through different phases, through different presidents. So based on what Bruce said, one of the things that stands out, that despite deep division in the United States, India relationship is one of the relationships for which there is bipartisan support. And the new phase started under Democrat Bill Clinton when he visited India in 2000. It was a Republican George Bush who completely transformed the relationship with the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement. It was a Democrat, Barack Obama, who articulated support for India's permanent membership of UN Security Council and visited us on our Republic Day, the first US president to have done that, declared India a major defense partner. And in 2015, during his visit, the two countries also issued a joint strategic vision for the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. And then again, it was a Republican Donald Trump, and many people tried to figure out exactly where he fitted in the Republican Party. But he also focused a lot on the India relationship, putting India in the category of strategic trade authorization level 1 for highest level technology releases, emphasizing the Indo-Pacific, emphasizing the framework of the Quad. So given that, I'm fairly confident that with the transition happening with the Biden administration or a Biden-Harris administration coming in, the relationship will continue with its positive trajectory. And as far as President-elect Biden is concerned, you may recall that in 2001, as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he had written to President George Bush asking for removal of sanctions against India. And many have pointed out in 2006 in an interview, he had said that his dream was that by 2020, the strongest relationship in the world should be between India and the United States. And so now we are at 2020, and he has the opportunity to put that into practice. So also, there will be some relationships that we need to watch, how the US takes that forward, because it will have an impact on India. And one of those would be Pakistan, because US wants to draw down from Afghanistan. And President Trump has already declared that he's going to bring troop levels down to 2,500. There are reports that he wants to lower it further. As Vice President, Joe Biden was one of the strong supporters for drawdown in Afghanistan. Now, as they do that, as they push for an agreement with the Taliban, they will need support from Pakistan because they believe that Pakistan's influence on Taliban would be important for that. Now, as this process plays out, what is the kind of relationship that he tries to do with Pakistan? Because the US policy on Pakistan has oscillated between incentivizing and pressurizing. After Osama bin Laden had been found there in 2011, the relationship with Pakistan went down. And yet in 2016, President Obama wanted to offer F-16 aircraft to Pakistan, which of course the Indian embassy and the government lobbied hard against, and finally the US Congress blocked that. So we have to see how that evolves, and that will certainly impact on us. The other relationship people would be watching would be the China relationship. But I believe that today, in a different way, there is again a broad bipartisan approach in the US that the US needs to deal with the China challenge, the economic, the technological, and the military challenge from China. And also, many have pointed out that the US needs to get its economy back on track. And Joe Biden himself has said that he's not going to enter into any new trade agreements till he has restored the competitiveness of the American worker. He has also called for reshoring of jobs to America, by America, getting more technology and innovation happening in the United States. And Bruce pointed out that he's the first Democratic president after a long time who does not have a Democrat-controlled Senate. So he needs to push various bills, bringing in some element of bipartisan cooperation. And an adversarial approach to China and projection of the challenge from China will enable the Democrats to get that bipartisan support for technology and economy-based provisions to go through the US Congress. Therefore, I believe that they will continue to see China as a major threat and challenge, and it will be different from the pre-2014 situation, when very often they spoke of strategic reassurance to China. And of course, later in the second half of the Obama administration, the talk was of rebalance or a pivot to Asia. Beyond this, I think there may be some challenges on issues related to human rights, because the progressive wing of the Democratic Party has a certain position on this. it does advocacy on that. But my own view is that in India we don't need to be defensive on this or be insecure in any sense. If you look at the way the U.S. elections have played out, US has huge problems related to human rights, systemic racism, voter suppression, gerrymandering of districts. So, this is something on which you can have a dialogue on the basis of a dialogue among equals. And people around Joe Biden have said publicly that any differences with India on this issue would be resolved on the basis of a dialogue among friends. That's the way to go. The other thing we would need to watch would be the very strong advocacy that will emerge from the US on climate change. And the very fact that John Kerry has been appointed as special envoy, has been given a seat at the table of the National Security Council, is a reflection of the importance that is going to be attached. So as that advocacy is done, and of course India is showing a lot of initiatives of its own, the International Solar Alliance, various things being done to lower the energy intensity in our GDP. But at the same time, there is a need for the US to recognize the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. There is a need for the US to acknowledge the impact of historical emissions. There is a need for the US, despite its own internal challenges, to recognize the need of developing countries for access to technology and finance. So if all this is put in a package, I think this issue can again be handled in a cooperative way. And I think the third major challenge we may face could be related to Russia, because in the US they have this CATSA, Countering American Adversary Through Sanctions Act, under which major defense purchases from Russia can be sanctionable. And just today, or yesterday US time, the US has sanctioned Turkey for purchase of S-400. Now, of course, India's position is different. India, unlike Turkey, is not a member of NATO. And so it's a different situation, but still we need to watch that. And my own hope would be that in its own interest, the United States will not sanction India, because if it does, then in India it would not be seen as a reliable partner. And as we are building this new relationship with the US, that's not the position in which US would like to find itself. And the final point I'd like to make is that we can do well in the coming period if we both focus on giving a reinforced thrust to economic cooperation. And because the strategic, the political dimension of our relationship is progressing well, and on the economic aspect, and again, when Arun Kumar was in commerce, we had started a strategic and economic dialogue. That was, of course, later transformed into the 2+2. But the economic aspect, if we bring in on the more geopolitical considerations, and if the two countries focus on the emerging areas of technology, artificial intelligence, cyber, quantum computing, digital data, and in those areas build new networks of cooperation. And if the governments on both sides, the businesses on both sides get involved in a deep dive discussion to build this framework of cooperation, then I think we can provide a solid foundation to the emerging political and strategic convergence. And that will help us navigate the next 4 years. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's a whole bouquet of issues there. And Ambassador Frank Wisner, the next speaker, who has four decades of U.S. diplomatic experience under his belt, and served 8 American presidents, and was the ambassador to Zambia, Egypt, the Philippines, and as we know him in India, as a former ambassador to India. So, Ambassador Wisner, Ambassador, your fellow ambassador has raised a whole set of different issues about the bilateral relationship. Now, the next 2 speakers after you will be talking about a lot of the economic side of it, but I'd like you to address, if possible, some of these concerns, and whether you think these are really things that we need to watch as far as the Biden administration is concerned.
I should say, terrific honor to be included in this gathering and to be a guest of CII, with which I worked very closely during my time as ambassador, and I'd like to underscore has been a mainstay in the development of the modern American-Indian relationship. You've considered in the broadest possible way the future of the Biden administration, and Arun Kumar has done a masterful job in looking at the American-Indian relationship. So let me sharpen the focus in a few minutes on three issues of particular foreign policy and security importance to our two countries. The first is China, which I regard, and I suspect all of you would agree with me, is the single greatest challenge that India and the United States face in our foreign and security policies. It is that issue, that relationship with China, that gives the strategic definition and undergirds our modern relationship, the most important. It is reflected not only in our bilateral exchanges, but in the existence of the Quad, which I believe will continue, will even expand. Our basic objective on the two sides is to work towards a restatement of the balance of power in along the Asian periphery, to write rules of the road and make certain those rules are respected and the balance is achieved between the two of us on the one hand, our friends and allies in China on the other. Now, under the Biden administration, Arun Kumar is absolutely right. We are going to see more continuity with Trump's approach to China than less continuity, but it will be different. It will be less raucous, more driven by the need to maintain alliances. We will approach China in partnership with our European allies and with India. It will be more strategic. In other words, Biden will seek to define outcomes before we engage in tactics. I believe in broad terms, the Biden administration will approach China with sort of three basic chapters. Number one, where China oversteps, where China threatens interests, where China impinges on the order of the region, the United States, preferably in consultation and in cooperation with its allies, including India, will confront. Second, the United States will compete. Ami Bara made a very important point about the need to strengthen supply chains, offshore, create greater strategic security to the supply chains. No question that will mean competition with China. Competition will extend into important areas like artificial intelligence. It will even be competition along China's periphery. There is no reason, in my judgment, to believe the United States, much less India, should stand aside and leave infrastructure development solely or principally in China's hands. So confront, compete, but also, and this will be important, cooperate, to look for areas where we and China can find common ground. We, India and China, can find common ground in climate change, in pandemic, dealing with the pandemic crisis that we're currently facing. So three basic structural directions: confront, compete, and cooperate. Our objective overall, the United States objective around which we will develop our relationship with you in India, is to bring China to respect our interests and the rules of the international order. And we'll talk a lot with each other. We'll be attentive to India's needs and perspective. Those will be important to us. Second, Pakistan. Pakistan, the relationship will be on the table and freshly re-examined when the Biden administration comes to power. And it will be reevaluated on the basis of American interests and American needs. It'll be based in part on what Pakistan does. It'll be based in part, as Arun Kumar said, on the exigencies of Afghanistan. It's not a relationship I would view as firmly fixed, and there will be change. but there will also be continuity. For as deep as our differences with Pakistan have been, reality drives us to maintain ties, particularly as we exit Afghanistan, particularly as we continue to face the problems of terror and the need for accurate intelligence, terror, fundamentalism. Now, in this regard, the Congress will play a role about Pakistan that could be different from that of the administration. The Congress is certainly likely to be less or more skeptical of the dictates of realpolitik than will the administration. But I suspect I could define the future of the US-Pakistan relationship as an unhappy marriage of convenience. So third, let me touch briefly on Afghanistan. And here, correctly, each of you, my predecessor speakers, have pointed out both sides of the American political equation. Democrats and Republicans are tired, are weary of our 19-year commitment. So the Biden administration will be faced with how to manage the exit and to manage it responsibly. The starting point will be wherever Trump leaves us, where the troop numbers will be, where the relationship with the peace process will be, where the relationship with Ashraf Ghani will be. All of these are at the moment fluid and need attention. But in the medium to longer term, the challenge to the Biden administration and to the United States is to switch from a military-oriented policy towards Afghanistan to a political one that finds balance with Russia, with China, with India, with Iran and Pakistan. It will be, I hope, a continuing financial support undergirding the American relationship, but I'm wary of how the Congress will handle that. I can make no promises. I lived through the withdrawal of the United States from Vietnam to notice how quickly political moods can change in the United States, however determined an administration is. So let me step back for a moment and join everyone on this panel today. I believe in the US-India relationship. I believe it will continue to be vibrant, and indeed, I even believe its best days of cooperation for both countries lie ahead of us. But like all relationship, this one needs tending. There are 4 areas that, Aaron, you brought to light. I fully agree with. You emphasized the dictates and requirements of trade and getting a trade agreement behind us. You can't literally run a relationship in which you have close political cooperation and you're slapping each other on the trade front. Second, I am convinced that the perception of human rights, the perception of tolerance, the perception of constitutional order will be on the table between the United States and India. And it can, Arun Kumar, you're right, be treated as a respectful, but it has to be regarded as an issue. It's important to the Biden administration. Human rights will be a cardinal feature. Third, Russia, you're absolutely right, Arun Kumar, with congressional law showing its teeth with Turkey, we have to be very mindful of India's historic relations with Russia. It's an issue to be managed as well. But as all taken together, we don't have an alliance between the United States and India. We do have a time of strategic convergence, closer than at any time in my lifetime and my experience with India. And therefore, I repeat, I continue to believe that convergence means the best days are ahead of us.
Thank you, Ambassador. I now turn to Arun Kumar, Chairman and CEO of KPMG in India. He served as Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Global Markets and was Director General of the U.S. Foreign and U.S. and Foreign Commercial Service during the Obama administration. Arun will be looking, among other things, I believe, at the supply chain issues that have been mentioned by a number of the other speakers. And one of the things I'll ask him to also to look at is that if trade, an understanding and agreement on trade is going to be important, does the fact that, if I'm correct, the Biden administration will lose fast-track trade authority sometime in June next year, but will probably not have the support of the Senate in getting it back, or would I be misreading that? Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Pramit. And just to clear up some potential confusion, Ambassador Wisner was talking about Ambassador Arun Singh, and he talked about Arun Kumar, not me. And I know that from President-elect Biden downwards, everybody knows who has the impressive shock of hair, and you can't make a mistake about that. So let me start by saying that we've heard some very great comments. All the previous speakers have painted a very comprehensive canvas on the US-India relationship. What I will do is to drill down a bit on the economic and commercial elements. May not be to the extent, Pramit, that you suggested, but let me take it a level below. To start with, I would think that the driving factors for the Biden administration with regard to India will be two. One will be its own domestic priorities. There is a health crisis and an economic crisis, actually, in both countries, and that will have to be a major focus. So to the extent that the India relationship and the India engagement can help advance domestic priorities, that would be extremely valuable. The second, as was mentioned, is China. Clearly in the US, there's a bipartisan change in the attitude towards China. The tone of engagement, as was mentioned, I think by Bruce, to China may be different in the Biden administration, but there will be continuity in many goals. Reducing the trade deficit, which was an issue during the Obama administration as well. We were quite engaged in that. Pushing for a level playing field, looking for less distortion in the markets by focusing on reducing the dominance of state-owned enterprises, and keeping a keen eye on technology rivalry. So both the domestic and the China factor will impact the US-India economic relationship. I would hope that there will be an intentional approach to the US-India economic relationship that ties to both domestic needs in both countries and to the geopolitical priorities. Domestically in the US and indeed in India, healthcare and jobs creation will have to be priorities. Healthcare, and this was referred to by Congressman Bera as well, is clearly an area of priority for both countries. And with India's vaccine and pharma manufacturing capacity, there is a role that India can play, not just in terms of serving its own population, but serving populations in the US and elsewhere. So the COVID-19 pandemic offers significant opportunities for the new administration to revitalize global health leadership. And this is an area where the US and India can work bilaterally and with multilateral agencies. India produces about 20% of the global requirement for generic drugs by volume, and apparently every third tablet of generics consumed in the US. So the increased importance of generic medicines in the American formulary will help manage costs, and that is a part of President-elect Biden's focus, managing healthcare costs, providing affordable healthcare, and Indian pharma could have a role to play to mutual benefit. Similarly, in terms of dependence on APIs, supply chain dependencies on China, India and the US both are focused on finding ways to alleviate that. India's advancing needs mean more opportunity for US medical technologies, devices, new medicines, and R&D capabilities, and that represents a huge opportunity for American companies as we look forward. So trade and exports will be important for job creation. The administration, I would expect, will look for wins in this area, and this could create some additional focus on India. As we know, Vice President Biden had famously set an ambitious target for US-India trade, and while there's been progress, there's a ways to go to get there. There are some areas within the whole trade spectrum that are natural candidates for focus. One, of course, is the reducing dependence on China for supply chains and the reconfiguration of supply chains. This should lead to more manufacturing being sourced in India and the region. And we're seeing a fair amount of progress in that space. The Indian government itself has come up with some new incentives, the production-linked incentives, for example, which can benefit both foreign and domestic manufacturers. And that can really help reconfigure global supply chains to some extent. Another area for consideration for both job creation and strategy would be defense, as was mentioned. India has been designated a major defense partner of the US. There's increasing collaboration in the defense space, leading to more manufacturing of defense equipment in India. This will go beyond, the benefits to India go beyond just manufacturing of defense equipment. It actually helps upgrade the manufacturing ecosystem. And so this is, again, another area where jobs can be created in both countries. The US's renewed focus on climate change should lead to greater cooperation on energy-related areas, which can range from smart grids and efficient energy technologies to renewables. I think Nisha might have more to say on that topic. Infrastructure, which was mentioned by a couple of speakers, should be an area of focus for both countries. This means for the US opportunities in India in urbanization, transportation, and power. And there is an important strategic element. Infrastructure plays in the Indo-Pacific to respond to the BRI program. Coming up, there will be potential to enhance mutual opportunities in 5G collaboration. Increased partnership between the two countries can accelerate the development and commercialization of technology solutions, because both countries will be looking for trusted vendors in the entire 5G ecosystem. And this could be another area for increasing trade and commerce. More than that, I think both countries should engage in shaping the rules of the new order in that space. Transitioning to 5G is a huge opportunity to advance innovation, to lower costs, and to really make all kinds of things possible that were not possible with previous technologies. This is an area where US and India collaboration can help address China's increasing dominance in that area. I would expect more broadly that we will see an eventual return to multilateralism in the Biden administration. The Trans-Pacific Partnership had aimed to set common rules for all parties, a rules-based order that all countries would then subscribe to. Now, with the ascendancy of the Indo-Pacific paradigm and the Quad Plus, possibly in the Biden administration, a successor to the TPP could include a wider canvas that at the right point could include India and enhance India's ability to partner with the US and the other TPP partners. Now, this may seem like a bit of a far-fetched dream at this point, but I do remember when the TPP was signed, Indonesia, the President Jokowi came to Washington and he said, I need to be part of the TPP. This was something that was not imaginable just 2 years before the TPP was signed. So I think if a TPP or a TPP-like agreement pulls in together a large number of countries into a certain rules-based order, I think you'll see that many countries will change their view of entering into a system of that nature. There's good reason to think, as was stated, that the Biden administration will continue to make the Indo-Pacific a significant opportunity. After all, as Vice President Joe Biden played a key role in the implementation of the pivot to Asia. For India, this could mean cooperation beyond defense and security, such as in economics, technology, and development. This takes me back to the point that Ambassador Arun Singh made. It is really important to get commerce and economics at the center of the relationship alongside strategic and defense considerations. This was a goal that the Obama administration had, and understanding that there's tremendous prosperity creating potential of such an approach of putting commerce and economics very at the center of the US-India engagement. So over to you, Prabhu.
Thank you. So I'll now turn to Nisha, Nisha Biswal is President of the US-India Business Council, Senior Vice President for South Asia at the US Chamber of Commerce, And as others have mentioned, she was served as Assistant Secretary for South and Central Asian Affairs in the State Department during the Obama administration. So Nisha, I'll turn to you. There are a whole host of economic issues, of course, and investment relation things that you know very well. But I'd also like you to touch on climate. I know that already that in some of the informal outreach from the Biden team to India, to New Delhi, climate has been at the top of the agenda. So please go ahead and give us some perspective on that.
Brumit, thank you so much. And thank you to CII for bringing us all together. Such an incredible panel of talent and expertise and experience on the U.S. corridor. One of the dangers of being the last on the illustrious list of speakers is that everything that needs to be said has been said, but not by everyone. And so maybe I'll add a few points of my own to what I think has been covered so far. First of all, as has been noted, we're going from strength to strength on the U.S.-India corridor. And so in addition to the major focus that the current administration has brought on the defense partnership and the strategic relationship, we see an opportunity in the next administration to really think about broader contours of the U.S.-India partnership and the ways in which the economic relationship can also help advance the strategic priorities between our two countries. And it's important to put it in that context, because I think what we have seen, not only in the current administration, but also to some extent in the prior one, is that when you put too hard of a partition between kind of the strategic priorities and then the trade and economic tensions, they get siloed and they get bracketed away. One gets advanced and the other languishes. And what we don't want to see is that the economic relationship languish, because it's too important for both countries. If we think about China as a geopolitical force to be reckoned with, it is a geopolitical force because it is a geoeconomic force. And we need to ensure that as we think about the U.S.-India partnership, that we recognize that the economic partnership is going to be critically important for both countries in sustaining and advancing the strategic partnership. With that in mind, I think we can look at some of the ways in which the trade and investment flows can advance some of these strategic priorities. We talked about climate and clean energy, and we've seen the energy relationship between our two countries continue to grow. The U.S. is fast becoming one of the major energy suppliers to India, and a focus on clean and renewable energy also means that the flows will also go in the reverse direction, with India also becoming a major supplier of renewable technology and investing in the United States in terms of advancing solar in the U.S. with a number of key Indian actors that have fast grown in that space. Another area in the climate and clean technology space is that as we think about the U.S.-India corridor and we think about supply chains, there is a real appetite in industry, U.S. and Indian, to play a greater role, both in terms of technology and in terms of the financing. And I think you will see this as a major area of focus between the U.S. and India. I think if you look at how a Biden administration is likely to approach the climate agenda, they will look at it as a whole of government exercise. And that means that there will be a climate lens that will be put on development financing, on private investment, and looking at institutions like the Exim Bank, like the new DFC, and really think about how you can support clean technology financing and the greening of the economy through financial instruments, private and public. That creates, I think, a real important opportunity for U.S.-India collaboration. We're already at the U.S.-India Business Council getting approached by our members, Indian and the U.S., saying they want to be part of that discussion. I'm part of the Aspen Track 2 dialogue from it, as are you, and I think that there's a real scope for how we bring the private sector to be a real force multiplier on advancing the climate agenda. And the U.S.-India corridor, I think, is going to be a key geography for that. We've heard quite a bit of discussion around COVID, and of course, the collaboration and investment in the life sciences space is important. India's capabilities in this space are going to be important, not only to how the U.S. Faces this challenge, but frankly, as we know, we won't overcome the pandemic locally until we overcome it globally. And to overcome the pandemic globally, it's going to also require the kind of capacity and the kind of global partnerships that India brings to the table. Also, I think that the Biden administration will be looking to rejoin the WHO and re-engage in a deep way. And India's position on the board of the WHO is also going to be very consequential. India's upcoming position as a non-permanent member of the Security Council starting in 2021 is also going to be very important to addressing a number of these global challenges. And I look to see a U.S.-India partnership that will engage early on, both in a bilateral and in a multilateral way. Finally, let me come to the area of trade and the fact that a trade agreement always seems somewhat off in the distance in the U.S.-India partnership. Look, you have two democracies where trade is very contentious, very politically controversial. I think Bruce's survey showed that while in the abstract people support free trade, when it gets specific, people have real concerns. And the constituencies that are adversely impacted are impacted much more specifically. The constituencies that benefit, sometimes it's much more diffuse benefits. And therefore, you have more vocal constituencies against trade than you have constituencies in support of trade. And that, in a democracy like the United States and India, becomes very difficult to advance. I would say that the U.S.-India trade relationship, even in the absence of a overarching agreement or even a mini deal, has been on an upward trajectory. We've seen trade and investment flows go from just north of 50 billion during the Obama administration to just shy of 150 billion at the end of the Trump administration. And that's not because there's been especially any major effort by governments to enhance that, but it reflects the growing importance of both economies for each other and of industries in both countries seeing the opportunity. Now, what a trade facilitation and a trade, either mini agreement or more overarching agreements will do is really help accelerate that pathway. But it's a hard hill to climb. I don't expect that a Biden administration will be looking to climb that hill, certainly not in the 100-day agenda and probably not in the first year in a major way. Nonetheless, there are things that can be done by both governments to lay the foundation. One of the things that they can do is get this mini deal out of the way. It has been essentially agreed to on both sides on the bulk of the issues, and yet the longer it festers, the less chances there are that it can actually get done. And the reason I say get it done is because you've already got some pre-negotiated agreements. Let's at least capture those and get those done. I think a Biden administration coming in is going to want to address some of India's contentious issues that India has raised with the United States, including respect to immigration for skilled workers, immigration visas for skilled workers, the H-1B, H-4, L-1 visa. I think that there will be early action on that. I suspect that a Biden administration will be looking at GSP and thinking about it in a different way. And those are important. And I think the 232 steel tariffs, which have also been an area of contention on the Indian side, are likely to be addressed in an early way by a Biden administration. India should, in response to all of that, also address the things that it has already committed to. Even if it's not done in the context of an agreement, there's an opportunity as a good faith measure to build confidence and to create that positive climate. India can also quickly advance those areas that have been under discussion between the two countries, including with respect to price control policies on medical devices, particularly at a time when there's going to be such a strong focus on healthcare collaboration, looking at ICT tariffs and addressing those, and other ways in which it can continue to invite further U.S. investment into Indian enterprises, which we have seen even in the midst of pandemic. You've seen FDI continue to increase. And then finally, the other area that I think is a major importance, and Arun has referred to it, and all of our previous speakers have referred to it, and that is on how is the future digital economy going to be built? Is the United States and India going to work together, try to create more harmonious approaches to digital and data governance, and create a digital economy that reflects the values of our democracies? Are we going to raise the conversation on a digital partnership to a strategic conversation, or are we going to continue to address issues in a more tactical and sometimes more contentious manner, where we see ourselves first as competitors rather than as collaborators and partners? So I think these are all areas that early on can be steered in the right direction and can really help inform the trajectory of the U.S.-India partnership, the economic partnership, to be able to flow in a way that is commensurate with the massive convergence we see on the strategic side.
Thank you. So yes, and I think Nisha has mentioned the digital side of it. I think is going to be important. Bob Lighthizer speaks tomorrow, and I presume he may raise this because, if I remember correctly, he was the one who had proposed and pushed very hard for a data dialogue between India and the US as part of a larger trade understanding. And unfortunately, the run-up, the first meeting on that, which was supposed to be held roughly in April, got canceled because of the pandemic. And I presume this is going to be picked up by USTR in the next administration. We still have a little bit of time left. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use the prerogative of the chair to ask each of you one basic, simple question, which I'll ask you to answer in a rapid manner. Bruce, I'm going to ask you a question. You've described a Biden administration, polarized America, no control or very weak control of the Senate that we'll actually know only a little bit later, and a Democratic Party that is also going to be internally divided by a progressive caucus on one side and so on. Plus, there's a sense, at least when I'm reading the US media, that Biden is going to be a one-term president, that he doesn't really want to be. He came in to defeat Trump. He's not going to necessarily run a second time. Is such an administration capable of actually carrying out the kind of enormous changes, both externally and internally, that everybody here is talking about?
Well, Pramod, I think that is the key question. And I think, A, of course, we don't know, but B, I think that it's got to be highly questionable, even though I would say personally, I believe those dramatic changes need to be done. And in all, honesty, I voted for Joe Biden. But I do think that there'll be a couple of tests. One is he gave a speech last night to the American people where he showed a certain toughness towards the Republicans and towards Donald Trump that we had not necessarily seen in the last month or so. I think he was trying to signal to his supporters that I can be tough in dealing with Mitch McConnell, the head of the Republican Senate, assuming the Republicans control the Senate. Because that's going to be one of the tests. Can he stand up to him, and can he prevail when he stands up to him? But not only does he face the challenge of getting some of the most progressive legislation through the Senate, and by progressive, I mean more spending to restart the economy. Remember, we did not spend adequate sums after the financial crisis and had the slowest recovery in modern history as a result. He has a very ambitious climate agenda, which is going to require money, which will be, Republicans are already expressing new concerns about debt, even though they didn't express any of those concerns under Trump. But if Biden is forced to resort to executive orders and regulatory changes to try to accomplish some things around climate and other issues, we have actually a very conservative judiciary now because of what Trump and McConnell have accomplished. Will they block that? So there are a lot of challenges ahead for this administration, and not the least of which is that history tells us, both in the after 2 years of Obama and after 2 years of Clinton, the Democrats experienced massive losses in the House of Representatives. It was an opportunity for Americans to say they were frustrated after 2 years and vote against the Democrats in the House of Representatives. The Democrats stand a very good chance of losing control of the House of Representatives. I know the congressman is going to dispute that, and they should, obviously, but the point is that history tells us a different story. So I do think that the challenges Joe Biden faces are enormous.
Congress, so perfect time to turn to Congressman Bera. Besides what Bruce has already mentioned, what do you see as the congressional priorities in the next 1 year?
So I agree with Bruce that our electoral cycles are perpetual nowadays, and so this first year of the Biden administration will be very critical because in a year we'll be gearing up for the midterms, and that will potentially create an immovable object in terms of getting legislation done, because the focus will be on that election cycle. I think the foreign policy realm is really ripe for bipartisan engagement, and most of the Republicans on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I suspect throughout Congress, while they were not vocal pushing against some of President Trump's approach when it came to global engagement, were uncomfortable with not necessarily the questions that the Trump administration were raising, but the tactics that President Trump often used. I also think there will be bipartisan, bicameral desire to get back into multilateral organizations like the World Health Organization, et cetera. I think within the region, though, there is bipartisan consensus on the strategic competition with China, and I think in that context you can get a lot done, which then engages how do we create multilateral coalitions like the Quad, but also ones that are reflective of the 21st century challenges. And I think you can start to lay some foundational work that allows us to address this great power competition with China, but with our like-minded allies. I think that's a place that's really ripe for bipartisan work. And again, you can't take a viewpoint of the next 4 years. This is a decade or multi-decadal. How do you start to build that in a bipartisan, bicameral way within Congress, but also in India, working with our parliamentarian colleagues as well.
Thank you, Congressman. I'll turn to Ambassador Arun Singh. We've talked about here, and there's obviously a great degree of hope in the Indo-US relationship. The trajectory has been good, and there's a lot of commonality between Modi and Biden on issues like climate, the pandemic. I would even argue on the digital side, there's a lot more agreement than is necessarily recognized. And of course, China. We disagree maybe on some other issues, but overall, the problem, I think, is putting all of this together. And you've correctly mentioned that there is a concern about things like human rights. There will be a concern to an extent about Pakistan and sanctions. What would you be, as a former US ambassador to India, advising your embassy right now? What would be your targets? What would you be trying to get done? Ambassador Singh, have we lost him?
Yeah, sorry. No, I'm saying that one of the things we all learn is that once you leave the government, don't advise your successors. You make your comments as a public intellectual, as it were. But that having been said, I think we have a very good base to build on. The people who have been indicated so far as coming back into the Biden-Harris administration were people who had played very important roles in the Obama-Biden administration. So, people who've been designated now as Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, DNI, and other positions, they were involved in nurturing the India relationship. And interacting with them, we could see that they saw it very positively. They saw the relationship in strategic terms. And therefore, I'm very confident that the new team will shepherd the relationship in a very, very positive direction, the US team. And therefore, I think for the Indian government, the Indian embassy, clearly the path would be to rebuild those relationships, to look at the newer people who are coming into the administration. But I think the bipartisan support for India, that should be sustained. Because as Bruce also mentioned, the politics in the US is going to be very toxic. Control over the Congress is going to be divided. President Trump is hovering in the background. He has felt that his legitimacy was impacted by the perception related to Russia's role in the 2016 elections. And he's working very hard to dent Joe Biden's legitimacy by talking about election fraud and stuff like that. And he's sustaining his hold on the Republican Party. So in this kind of atmosphere, and with President Trump potentially mounting a bid in 2024 for the presidency. With this kind of atmosphere, I think the Indian effort has to be that you maintain the bipartisan support for the relationship. And then the third thing that I think we should do, which people have hinted about, is go beyond the political and strategic convergence, give a lot of emphasis in looking at the economic relationship from the strategic perspective, hold a dialogue around that and build equity. Because one of the things I found, for example, the Trump administration removed GSP benefits from India. This issue came up repeatedly, even during the Obama administration. But it was not taken away because the Democratic Obama administration looked at the issue with a certain amount of empathy, understanding that people in India involved in those products were from labor-intensive industries. So that gives us something to build on. But I think we need to look ahead, look at emerging technologies, and build a framework for cooperation for those areas.
Thank you. Ambassador Wisner, I'm going to ask you a simple question. From what I've seen of the statements by Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, Donilon, during the campaign at least, what it has been missing has been any real reference to the Quad. The Quad doesn't get much mention among the Biden team, other than Michelle Flournoy, who has spoken extensively about the Quad, but unfortunately may not be joining the cabinet, at least in the position that we assumed she would be. There hasn't actually been much conversation about the Quad, and if anything, the Biden administration's policy seems to be that our handling of China will be built around rebuilding our alliances in the Atlantic and the Pacific, building economic coalitions against China, but there will be a de-emphasis on the military side of the equation, partly because I think they want to cut some defense money. but the Quad doesn't come in. Is that something India should be concerned about? You may have to unmute.
Apologies. I think your fears are somewhat exaggerated. I believe while there's been no explicit reference to the Quad, the logic of the Quad will be embedded in Biden's administration's approach to the region and to the India relationship. Why so? Because, and I tried to point it out in my remarks, undergirding our approach to dealing with China is to install a balance of power. And for that to exist, you need a coherence of relations between yourself and the other littoral states, some of which we have treaty arrangements with, but the Quad adds a dimension to it. So I frankly think what we're going to see is the Quad, and indeed Quad Plus. The Quad need not only be a military undertaking, it must be a political one. For at the end, that's what's going to change China's behavior. Having said that, I also firmly believe that Biden will continue a steady defense modernization program and give priority to the naval deployments and naval readiness of the United States. And that will mean a strengthening of our naval and military presence in the Pacific area. I feel confident that's another line of continuity with the Trump period. We will continue to insist, as we started in the Clinton administration, on rights of passage through the South China Sea. We will continue to maintain support for Japan over the Senkakus, and we will keep a very wary eye on Taiwan. I don't believe any of those changes will be altered, and India can bank on a robust American military presence in the region. But basically, the point I'm trying to drive at, and I think is important to the future of our relationship with India, is that it's not just going to be a military relationship. It needs to give priority to the political context within which we operate and the coordination of those contexts.
Thank you. Arun Kumar, I'm going to ask you a question. You have President Biden, or President-elect Biden, who in his campaign spoke about a Buy America First strategy, that government procurement in America would be directed towards U.S. companies, that he would not go for new multilateral or any type of trade agreement for at least for the initial period. Speaks about building an infrastructure, rebuilding American infrastructure, but also trying to ensure that not all of those contracts necessarily go to basically implicitly Chinese companies. On the other hand, you have Modi talking about self-reliant India, raising tariffs by 3 or 4 percentage points over the past 5 or 6 years. Is there going to be a problem? And in the midst of all this, you mentioned the issue of supply chains, movement out of China, India trying to bring some of that to India. Trump administration, at least, was actually relatively supportive of such actions. They did provide some push, if you wish, to that supply chain movement. But if you're going to have two presidents, both of whom are going to be very focused, one prime minister and one president, on domestic jobs, domestic production, how exactly are we going to reconcile this in the larger bilateral relationship? You may have to unmute.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think when you hear the subtext, for example, Make in India or Make America Great Again, the subtext also is to be competitive. So if it is not make in India, it should not be make in India no matter how uncompetitive, or make in America no matter how uncompetitive. So the subtext, which I think is lost, is to make it in each country in a competitive fashion. And the US-India context, what can that collaboration be that makes each other more competitive? I think the danger is that that subtext is lost, and it becomes a protectionist argument. And there are plenty of interests in both countries that would push the protectionist argument. But I think it's important that there's a realization that that it's about making competitive. Second, I think it also means how you operate, how businesses in both countries operate in each other. So, for example, if an Indian company invests in the US, they get national treatment and can compete for Make in America. And there needs to be a reciprocal approach. So there are ways in which these things are managed by companies which eventually want to capture markets and win in the marketplace.
Thank you. So Nisha, I'm going to leave the last word to you. We've seen an enormous amount of money coming in, investment coming in from the United States into India, built around these so-called digital hubs or super apps, Facebook, Google, Amazon, Walmart, coming in and partnering with Reliance Jio or their own super apps. And that's one set of investments that are coming in. We've seen the new PLI scheme in electronics, at which the core of it is this plan or prospect of Apple shifting potentially as much as 20% of its supply chain production out of China to India, and possibly other companies following suit. And you've mentioned that climate may be one of the next big areas where both American finance and investment may start to be coming in to India or partnering with India. All of these indicate, especially, for example, the super apps, you automatically see a de facto joining at the hip of India and the United States digitally on a scale that you will definitely not see India or the US doing with, let's say, China, let alone what a lot of the other things you're saying. What are the other areas do you see that potential, that size of a potential happening between the two countries? And what is needed to ensure that that actually happens?
Well, that's a great question. And I think, in many ways, each of these things builds on on another. And so a few areas that I think we're going to see, really continue to grow as we look to this relationship. Arun mentioned the defense supply chain. And this is something that your external affairs minister, even when he was ambassador, talked about. How do we help to ensure that India is part of the global defense supply chain? To some extent, that is already starting to happen as you see more and more U.S. companies have some component of their supply chain housed in India. I think there's a real potential for that to further grow, both as India continues to grow in its own defense modernization and becomes a major player, but also becomes a major partner for many other countries. So I think the defense supply chain is something that will continue to be important and show great growth potential. We talked about life sciences, and we talked about clean technology as other areas. We talked about the digital economy, not just in terms of the app-based investments, but actually digital commerce, which is still in nascent stages in many parts of the world, including in India, but which through the impact of the COVID pandemic has really started to see major growth opportunity. And India is positioning itself not only in terms of being a major player in digital commerce within India, and Indian industries are making major investments in building up that capacity. But India also stands to be a major player globally on digital commerce. And I think this is where we should be thinking about the opportunity for collaboration. And I think that the industries in both countries are certainly thinking about that, but our regulatory approaches need to catch up to that. I think there's an artificial distinction that perhaps sometimes is being made, whether it's on data, whether it's on, whether a company is considered Indian or considered American, whether foreign investment into an Indian company is changing the color of how it is viewed. I think these issues need to get addressed because we are going to continue to be in a global economy. Indian industry is fast rising to be global players. We want to incentivize and facilitate that rise of Indian industry in the global marketplace. Facilitate Indian industry being a major investor in the United States and elsewhere. And the way to do that is to really start to think about these partnerships not from the impact of, well, is this an American investment coming into India? What is the color of the money or the color of the technology? But really about kind of where the partnership capacitates the larger impact of the economy and the larger impact and benefit to the consumer. And I think that this will allow a major growth that grows beyond India's border. Ultimately, India, I think, will need to think about trade liberalization from the perspective of how it accesses global markets. But in many ways, a U.S.-India partnership, even prior to trade agreements, can actually give access to major markets in both directions and also open doors globally. So that's what I would like to see recognized in both countries. There is a real danger, as Arun and others have noted, in democracies to take a more populist, more protectionist turn and mindset. But the advantage to a rising economic power like India, is to think of itself not as a market to be protected, but as a ability to really be able to capture more of the global market share.
I fully agree. If you're going to be competitive, the only purpose of being competitive is to basically export. Therefore, your trade policy has to adjust accordingly. We do have one where we are out of time, and we have covered, I think, more than we could possibly have expected in the UTU. But we do have one question, so I will throw it out, and I possibly Congressman Bera or maybe Ambassador Wisner would like to consider this. President-elect Biden has said that he will be holding a conference of democracies. And he also, I believe, wants to hold a global climate summit. I can see India definitely being invited to the global climate summit. The Conference of Democracies, what will India be invited, and what would anybody expect us to do there?
I'll take a crack at it. I can't imagine a scenario where India would not be invited as the world's largest democracy. I don't have any particular insight on what's driving that, other than I think we see a time where you see autocratic leadership versus democratic leadership, and I think it's a chance for a President-elect Biden or Biden-Harris administration on the global stage to reaffirm this commitment to democratic values and democratic principles and build this coalition of vibrant democracies.
Thank you.
All due respect, I'm going to differ with you just slightly. I think it's a great idea for every reason you've just cited. But when you actually sit down and begin to think about who is going to be invited And more importantly, who is not going to be invited, and what are the consequences on your relationships with nations that aren't invited, I think you begin to run into some pretty harsh realities. So frankly, from my perspective, I'm not holding my breath for the convening of a conference on democracies.
Yeah, do you bring in Erdogan of Turkey? Do you bring in lots of curious countries that'll have to be put into place? Well, thank you, everybody. That was a great session, and I think we covered an enormous amount of ground. I'm actually relatively optimistic about the Indo-US relationship after this. I think the potential's always been there, and I think we're going to see a fair amount of convergence on a whole set of fronts, just as long as we get the procedures and the little problems of process done and handled. Thank you, everybody. And I hand it back to the Confederation of Indian Industries.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was amazing. I'll pick it up on email. Thank you.
And recognizing that, like Skype, you're not going to be able to cover 54 countries, right? So you have to kind of think about